Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm Dr. Anthony Mazzella. On this channel, we go beyond labels and symptoms to explore the inner, often unconscious, emotional world behind narcissistic and related personality patterns. In these short clips from the full podcast, you'll get a clear, compassionate, psychodynamic insight into behavior. Here's a short clip from the podcast that highlights what this looks like in real life. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, I'm taking you behind the scenes of my thinking process as I prepare material for my upcoming personality disorders class. I want to walk you through how I actually reason clinically when I'm trying to differentiate between borderline and narcissistic dynamics, especially in moments where the behavior can look deceptively similar. I'm starting with a small, ordinary-looking scene. Someone sitting quietly on the couch, disengaged, withdrawn. And the question I found myself asking wasn't, is he shutting down? But what does that shutdown mean? And what was happening inside of him at that moment? This is actually a very important diagnostic question because shutdown, withdrawal, and protest can show up in both narcissistic and borderline organizations. On the surface, they can look nearly identical. But the inner logic, the emotional meaning to the shutdown, the function of the behavior, and most importantly, what happens next is very different. So in this episode, I'm going to compare and contrast how this exact same behavior operates in narcissistic versus borderline personality organization. We'll look at what's driving it, what the person is protecting against, and how to tell whether we're looking at narcissistic injury or borderline rage and decompensation. And by the end, I hope you'll have a clearer psychodynamic way of answering the question that comes up so often in real life. Is this NPD or BPD? Or, as I would prefer to say, are we looking at narcissistic or borderline dynamics? And if you're listening because you see yourself in these moments, if you've noticed yourself going quiet, pulling back, or shutting down in relationships and wondering what's actually happening inside of you, this episode is for you too. By the end, I hope you'll have a clearer way of understanding your own reactions. That kind of understanding is often the first step toward more choice in how you're going to respond in these moments, and then therefore more control over what happens next. So, let's set the stage. Imagine a husband whose in-laws are visiting for the weekend. His wife is busy. She's hosting, she's coordinating, she's emotionally attuned to her parents. Her attention is pulled elsewhere. Nothing dramatic is happening, no argument, no obvious rupture. But he starts to fade out. He's not very interested in helping her or helping with the kids. He's distant. He ends up sitting on the couch, scrolling, half present, not fully gone, but not really there either. From the outside, it looks like disengagement, maybe even avoidance. But clinically, that's not the question I'm interested in. The question is, what is that withdrawal doing for him in that moment? What led up to the withdrawal? And does he have the capacity to step back and reflect on what really happened? So already, just that in and of itself, being able to step back and think is already a diagnostic indicator whether we're looking at more narcissistic or borderline organization. And this is where diagnosis can easily go wrong. If you only stay focused on the behavior, that's the withdrawal, the shutdown, the pulling away, you'll miss what actually distinguishes one personality organization from another. Both narcissistic and borderline organizations can show and have shared surface features. Both organizations what do we see? We can see intensive reactivity to loss of attention. So that's one thing they both show. As this moment is explored though, he can say in this example that I'm giving you that he no longer felt special. His wife's attention shifted away and suddenly he was expected to give his full attention to the kids right at the moment when he wanted attention. What stands out is the abrupt loss of centrality that precedes his shutdown. Also, both can show withdrawal following perceived relational injury. The injury here isn't a fight or an explicit rejection. It's quieter, no longer being the center of his wife's attention and feeling left alone. That was the shift right there. And both can show difficulty tolerating thirdness. Thirdness is any rival. It's any other. It doesn't even have to be a person, by the way. It could be a job. It could be a hobby. In this case, the in-laws function as the third, a competing other that absorbs attention and reorganizes the relational field. And finally, both of them have indirect expression of anger rather than verbal articulation. So both of them, right? We could see that, well, let me just stay with this example. This anger is largely outside of his conscious awareness. Like, we don't see him getting angry in that example of him sitting on the couch, withdrawn. He presents more as what? Deflated and disengaged rather than angry. But you can hear it in his complaints, in the resistance to taking care of the kids, in the retreat to the couch. This is what we call passive aggressive. So the anger comes out, it seeps out in a passive way, a quiet pulling back of vitality and punishing his wife. In other words, he's leaving her alone because he felt that she left him alone. So now she's on her own with the kids and the in-laws, so she's juggling everything. What I'm emphasizing is the shutdown in and of itself is not diagnostic, right? The intensity and subjective meaning of the shutdown is. So let's keep going and try to understand this behavior. And by the way, we're talking about an emotional shutdown, which may also look like an emotional collapse. And I put that in your mind because we're trying to figure out, how would this be different? What looks different? What feels different? In terms of distinguishing between NPD and BPD. So let's look at now his core experience. This is now getting into the inner logic. The shutdown here appears to be primarily a response to a narcissistic injury, a collapse of being central, admired, or uniquely chosen. But what's the function of the shutdown? The shutdown functions and acts as withholding. That's what I just mentioned a moment ago in the passive aggressiveness, rather than him feeling completely abandoned. In other words, the inner logic is, if I'm not special, I will not give my vitality. In other words, I'm not going to be alive. I'm not going to be present unless I am the center of attention. This is an angry disengagement, not panic. And I'm saying that, I'm planting a seed for you to think about this, because panic, in contrast to the angry disengagement experienced here, is typically a more visceral, dysregulated response to perceived abandonment or threat. It often involves heightened arousal, fear of annihilation, I have to come back to that word, and a desperate need for reassurance or containment. This kind of collapse is more characteristic of borderline organization, where the shutdown is driven by intense anxiety and fear of being left alone, uncontained, rather than by anger over a loss of centrality or a narcissistic injury. So let's go over annihilation, because it's so important, and you often hear this in social media. The way that I'm using that concept is, there's an overwhelming fear that one's sense of self or one's existence is at risk of being destroyed. So what does that actually mean? Behaviorally, like if we look at the behavior that we would see on the surface, what you would see is intense panic, terror, desperation, feelings of being, what? Empty inside. And actually, I shouldn't even say these are behaviors. Let me correct that. These are inner experiences, because we're talking about what's at the core. But if we look at the behavior, what we actually see are frantic efforts to seek reassurance, to cling or control others, to maybe they're going to engage in self-harm, to feel affectively alive again, especially if they're feeling annihilated and dead or empty inside. There may be intense self-harm. So what's the psychodynamic meaning of all this? The last thing I said is, what's the psychodynamic meaning? It reflects a collapse of psychic structures that normally contain and regulate feelings, intense feelings. That's the ability, what that means is the ability to soothe oneself and the ability to think instead of act on the feelings, like I was just describing in the behaviors. With the borderline organization, you see more acting rather than reflecting. So when there's this collapse of psychic structure, again, the ability to soothe oneself and think, This often triggers regression to a very, what we call primitive defenses. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I just mean that these are early defenses that get developed in childhood. And these defenses distort reality more than what we consider mature defenses, which are more adaptive. So this triggers regression to primitive defenses such as what? Splitting, projection, projective identification, denial, idealization, and devaluation. Those are a few of the most primitive, or let's just call them early level, most reality distorting defenses that get pulled upon. But now we have to think about containment, because containment allows for a self to feel safe, but they don't feel safe. That in this, when there's this kind of collapse in the psychic structure, there's a feeling of like, I feel scared, right? But if there's not a complete collapse, they could say to themselves, but I'm still me. Or they can say, this hurts, but it will pass. And by the way, that's one of the interventions. One of the things that patients have found very helpful that I use is we begin to look at, yes, this is a very intense feeling, but just yesterday your wife was there with you. And will she not be there with you again once the in-laws leave? In borderline organization, distress reflects a failure of containment. So you lose this capacity to comfort, reassure yourself, to evoke a memory. So what we see is panic, fear of annihilation, again, that's the falling apart, and then movement very quickly into a dysregulated state. Emotions go up, thinking and reflecting goes down. In narcissistic organization, these structures remain more intact. For those of you who have been following along, you know I constantly talk about the grandiose sense of self. That's the main structure that holds the narcissist together. And one of the differentiating qualities when we're thinking about NPD or these characteristics, these borderline versus narcissistic characteristics. Okay, let's go back to the core experience of the withdrawal, sitting on the couch. What is the relationship to others? So we're going through all the different things that I'm assessing as I hear this story. Others are experienced as failing to mirror him. Remember, he lost his wife's attention. The rivalry is central. Remember, those are the in-laws, or a job, or your wife going out with her friends. That's the third that I mentioned. The distress centers on loss of specialness and centrality. So there's the distress right there, that you are no longer the center of attention. You no longer feel special, acknowledged, recognized. In contrast, in borderline organization, the core response is less about rivalry and more about fear of abandonment. And not even fear, but let me say complete abandonment or loss of that emotional containment that I mentioned a moment ago. The presence of a third is experienced not as competition, but as evidence of being left, replaced, or erased, often triggering what? Panic, and then that clinging, that desperation, or emotional collapse that I mentioned earlier, rather than what we see in a more narcissistic organization, that angry withdrawal. So I hope you're beginning to get a sense, like qualitatively, this feels very different. Now, in the more borderline organization, others are called upon and are needed as external regulators. And the feelings are different too. Like with this fellow, we do see anger. We do see envy at the in-laws. We do see resentment. And of course, shame is present as well. But it's covered by the control of the withdrawal. So you don't see shame on the surface, right? There's no overt or catastrophic fear of falling apart. You don't hear that in his story. You don't hear annihilation anxiety or intense abandonment. In contrast, in borderline organization, rage would be more explosive and the whole situation would unfold in a much more chaotic way. There would be far less capacity to hold the anger without acting it out. And you would experience, again, I referred to this in the prior episode, an affect storm, something I mentioned earlier, and I went into far more detail, but you could go back and check that out. But that's when things really start to get chaotic because you cannot control your affective experience. There's still so much more to explore about this topic and related dynamics. If you're finding this discussion helpful and you want to learn more about the various facets of narcissism and related personality organizations, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video clip. If you want to do an even deeper dive, check out my podcast. I go into far more detail there. Okay, until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now.